President introduced his budget, as we know, earlier this week, and anticipates in his budget a deficit of about $1.2, $1.3 trillion. It's coming down from $1.5 trillion, and the budget he's submitted is expected to bring the deficit down to about $900 billion, only $900 billion, and that's still one heck of a lot of money. And if you think about the size of our budget deficit about 2 years ago, I think our budget deficit was as much that in that 1 year as maybe all of our nation's budget deficits added together for the first 200 or 210 years of our nation's history. The point I'm trying to make is our national debt is a huge problem, a growing problem. It's one we're attempting to address in responsible ways, balance revenues and spending restraints. But it's something we have to work on every day. I like to say everything I do, I know I can do better. If it isn't, my dad used to say, if it isn't perfect, make it better. He said all that was admonition to my sister and me for many years. And I think the same is true with respect to most of everything we do. We can do better. Same is true with federal programs. And one of the challenges for us is to make sure that we're getting our money's worth. We're getting taxpayers' money's worth in everything, whether it's defense, whether it's weapons systems, whether it happens to be environmental programs, whether it happens to be health care, whether it happens to be education, including post-secondary education. Along with Jim Webb, I was fortunate enough to come back to this country near the end of the Vietnam War and go to graduate school on the GI Bill. Others of our co-sponsors may be veterans as well, may have benefited from the GI Bill. It was a big help for me. It was like $200 a month. And in 1973, 74, 75, that seemed like a lot. I flew with reserves and was able to pay my bills and get by. Today, the GI Bill's, the Webb GI Bill, was sponsored by Jim Webb. The benefits are extraordinary. As you know, go to University of Delaware, Delaware State University, or University of California or North Carolina, and Virginia, and tuition paid for, full tuition paid for at these schools. Books, fees, tuitions paid for, tutoring paid for, even a housing allowance of $1,000 a month. The E5 housing allowance is pretty extraordinary compared to $200 a month. And I certainly don't begrudge anybody those kinds of benefits today. This is a volunteer Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and we want to make sure that people sign up, good people sign up, and that they benefit from this. But we want to make sure, as we spent, I think so far in the first several years of the new GI Bill, we spent about $11.5 billion to send veterans back to school to get an undergraduate degree or graduate degree or some other kind of training. And we want to make sure, I want to make sure, our co-sponsors, Congresswoman Speier, Congressman Jones, and others want to make sure, hi, how are you? I want to make sure that we're getting our money's worth. Recent reports, as we know, show that many veterans have been subjected to questionable recruitment practices. However, when going to some of these schools, deceptive marketing and substandard education instruction in some of the schools, not all, but some of the schools that they attend, including some for-profit schools, not all for-profit schools. These problems highlight a key flaw in our higher education system. Currently, the incentives at some schools, including some for-profit institutions, I just believe we've misaligned the incentives. And what we should be doing is incentivizing schools to bring people into programs that when they're ready for them, train them for real jobs, for the real world, so that when they graduate and finish up, they'll have the skills that they need. Some of the bad actors in the for-profit industry are rewarded for enrolling more students, especially veterans with a fully paid-for education, but have a little incentive to make sure that their veteran students are prepared to join the workforce and to begin productive careers. Having said that, I'm going to say again as clearly as I can, this is not an issue just for for-profit schools. There are a number of nonprofit schools that experience similar issues with low degree completion rates, high default rates, and a poor record of serving our veterans, preparing them for careers where they can support themselves and provide for their families. And to be fair, there are also a number of for-profit schools that offer, that have a history of placing students in good-paying jobs. I'll say this: when I think, Walter, I moved 13 times in my 5 years of active duty. from when we're going to Southeast Asia and back and all. And the idea of being able to get, through distance learning, to get an education, if you're going to be deployed or detached throughout your years in the military, that's actually a very good business model and can be very good for the students as well, especially people that are in the military. Done right, done well. But while there's clearly work to be done to improve the nonprofit sector, our efforts today focus on the 90-10 rule, which is one of the few rules in place that try to prevent the bad actors in the for-profit industry from taking advantage of students wasting taxpayer-subsidized education benefits. Specifically, our bill seeks to correct the failings of the 90-10 rule to protect veteran students from these bad actors. Under current law, as you may know, in order for a for-profit school to receive federal student aid from the Department of Education, the school must ensure that no more than 90% of its revenues come from federal funding. The definition of federal funding that applies to this limit is not as straightforward as one might expect. It turns out to be that under current law, federal funding means only money that comes through the Department of Education. Other federal funds, such as GI Bill benefits that come from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and military education benefits offered through the Department of Defense are excluded from the 90% limit that makes up the federal share of a school's revenues. This means that a school that maxes out on its 90% limit can bring in federally funded military and veteran education benefits in order to skirt this limit, and in some cases to get 100% of their funding from the federal government. First and foremost, I don't believe in this day and age that any school or institution should be allowed to get 100% of its funding from the federal government. Second, as several reports have shown, and most recently in an op-ed in the New York Times that some of you may have seen, written by Holly Petraeus, this loophole has put a target on the backs of military and veteran students. It's led some bad actors in the for-profit sector to employ non-ethical recruitment practices and deceptive marketing to entice veterans and military students to use their benefits at their campuses. Upon enrollment, some of these veterans and military students find that the promises made by the recruiters of lucrative career paths and credit transferability fall well short of expectations. We've heard accounts of veterans who've had to burn through their GI Bill benefits only to find their education is of little value in the job market, leaving them with few prospects for continuing their education and sometimes even burdening them with additional debt. As I said earlier, I try to live by the philosophy that everything I do, I know I can do better. Rosa, how are you? Nice to see you. The same philosophy can be applied to veteran and military education. We have a moral imperative to make sure that we all do a better job raising educational outcomes for military personnel and for our veterans. And we still have a responsibility to our taxpayers, our service members, and our veterans to make sure that when our warriors come home to start their new career as students, that they aren't subjected to these kind of deceptive practices. And that's why Senators Webb, Hagan, Rockefeller, McCaskill, Franken, Johnson, and Harkin and I are introducing legislation in the Senate today that will count Department of Defense tuition assistance and GI Bill funds on the 90% side as federal funds, which is what those funds are. I believe they were offering a common sense, I call this a common sense approach to this important issue, one that's been vetted with and is supported by many veteran and military service groups and leaders. And as you'll hear later here today, our legislation is also supported on the House side. We thank you, Congresswoman Speier, and others who are joining you in that effort, who are here today and some who are not. But with a bipartisan bill that mirrors our bill, and you'll be introducing, I understand, your bill today. We look forward to working with our colleagues, not just in the Senate, but very much in the House of Representatives, to pass what we believe is important legislation, continue to improve educational outcomes for our military, for our service members, and for our taxpayers.